welcome everyone, and welcome to those who are going to turn up shortly. Welcome to Life on the Planning Frontier, working in Melbourne's growth areas. So this is, I think, really an event part of the Employability Week in University of Melbourne, but we're also reaching out to sort of students and others in universities around the Melbourne area. My name is Nick Phelps. I'm the Chair of Urban Planning. And perhaps before we get started, I will just do the customary acknowledgements of country. So I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land upon which we're meeting today. For me, that's the Wurundjeri. I happen to live pretty near to the university in Parkville. But of course, for others, it will be other traditional owners, and we extend our acknowledgement to all of those owners, and we pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. So the title for tonight's event was Life on the Planning Frontier, and I guess it was meant to be a bit of a kind of a play on the fact that, you know, this is the frontier of where activity is occurring in the planning world, to give you a flavour, I suppose, of some of the excitement that exists in the growth areas around Melbourne, not necessarily in the downtown area. We're used to looking at the tall buildings downtown, but when you get out to the edges of Melbourne, this is where really rapid growth is occurring. Opportunities for place shaping abound, but of course many challenges. So we have a team of panelists who can speak to some of those opportunities, excitements, challenges, I think, of having a working experience in one of the growth area councils. We're having a first webinar this evening. We'll probably have a second one later on in the year to cover some of the same issues with some of the other growth area councils. So we'll have done a couple of meetings, I think, which will be a useful thing. We've got 1 hour or so, perhaps a little bit over, and I'll just very briefly mention the three speakers because they're going to introduce themselves also briefly as well. So we have JAMEY BARBAKOS from the city of Whittlesea, Roger Sutich, who is standing in for Bob Baggio, who was advertised but has had to, at short notice, withdraw from the event, and then SPRATLING, who is from Wyndham City Council. I won't take any longer for now. I'll hand over, I think, to let's go in that order. So it was Jamie, Roger, and then Caitlin to briefly introduce yourselves and say a bit about perhaps how you've ended up in those growth area council jobs, and give us a flavour of your positions. I think would be great. Jamie.
As Nick said, I'm JAMEY BARBAKOS. I'm the acting team leader at the Growth Area Development Assessment team at the City of Whittlesea. First of all, thank you for having me, and it's great to see so many people interested in growth area planning. I've been a planner for about 18 years. Certainly the first part of my career, I worked in urban areas, in a city and one peri-urban council. I was exposed to a wide range of development applications, from materials recycling plants to multi-storey development. But after a while, I sort of felt that I had developed my expertise and I just wanted to expand my horizons. I was also really interested in strategic planning, and I thought growth area planning would be a good mix of statutory and strategic planning. So often with growth area projects, whilst you might be assessing a planning application, you do have to think about the flow-on effects to adjacent land holdings and how that impacts upon the developability of adjoining sites. So I moved to the City of Whittlesea, and I've really had a really enjoyable time working on major projects in the growth areas of the municipality. So you're really getting the opportunity to work on projects that create a sense of place and a sense of community.
Okay, Roger, do you want to?
Thanks, Nick. Hello, everyone, and to echo Jamie's words, It's great to see so many people interested in planning and growth area planning in particular. My name is Roger Sutich. I'm the coordinator of the major developments team at the City of Melbourne. I've been a planner for a little over 30 years. Started my career when I graduated back in the late 80s at the City of Whittlesea, where Jamie is at the moment, and spent quite a number of years there in a variety of roles, and focused very much on growth area planning back in about 2010, 2011. And again, it's the thing that brought me to, or that interested me in growth area planning, was the fact that we do have an opportunity to value add to a municipality and the residents of that municipality, as well as the City of Melbourne. It's a very dynamic field. It is very, very busy. In my time at Melton and Whittlesea, we have some of the biggest developers in Australia undertaking various projects, from the Stocklands of this world, Mirvac, Lendlease and so forth. There are a lot of challenges as well in terms of project management, because some of the projects last a decade or more very easily, some of the larger estates. And it's also almost like putting a jigsaw puzzle together, where there's a lot of land fragmentation. It gets more challenging, and having advanced project management skills is very, very important, and understanding stat planning, and as Jamie said, strategic planning, having some skills in both fields, I find to be a huge asset, because as a stat planner, you need to make sure you dot your I's, cross your T's, and as a strategic planner, you need to see the bigger picture. And a lot of the work that we do in the growth areas, you do need to see the bigger picture. And sometimes you need to think. I know stat planners occasionally think, what's wrong with this particular project, whereas strategic planners generally think, how can we get this? This looks pretty good. How can we get it over the line? So there are a lot of challenges, and developing relationships, positive working relationships, professional relationships is very, very important, because the applicants that we get are here for the long term.
Caitlin, you want to come and say a bit about yourself?
Hi, my name's Caitlin. So I'm from City of Wyndham. So I graduated in 2016, so I'm a bit younger, and my career is not as long as my counterparts. But I went straight into a growth area council, so I was really lucky from that perspective. And I graduated with a double degree in landscape architecture and urban planning. So I initially started as a landscape architect at Wyndham City, working in landscape approvals for growth area projects, and then went across to town planning and started working in a statutory space. From there, I've worked mostly in as a subdivision planner, which is a hybrid role at Wyndham. So we work in both subdivisions and in the growth area planning. So they are slightly different, but I get the luxury of working between multiple legislation and understanding all the multidisciplinary aspects of what we do. Big focus on post-permit work, so that being anything that happens after the planning permit's issued. So the team I work with at the moment is all about making sure that the applicant does what they need to do, and helping teams determine what they need to facilitate and how to help the applicant get across the mark. From my experience at Wyndham and then growth area planning, it's just you're constantly learning, and I think everyone says that, but it's a never-ending space where you get a really huge opportunity to work with strategic planners and lots of interesting applicants and lots of different types of disciplines like engineering and landscape architects and urban designers, and it's just an incredibly interesting space to work in. And given it's pretty early in my career, I really love it, and I would always encourage anyone to get into that space as soon as you can, because it's a bit of an eye-opening experience for a grad especially.
Okay, thanks, Caitlin. And just I probably should have mentioned this at the start, of course. If you've got questions, please do send them in, because we can pose them to the panelists. So if you've got specific things you want to know more about, we've already covered quite a lot of ground there, I think. So if there are particular things you want to know about, you know, just fire those questions in, and we can put them to the panel. I mean, Caitlin, you charted a trajectory there from landscape architecture into planning. Okay, so that sounds like planning is kind of, you know, more exciting than landscape architecture. Is that true? Yeah.
I think it has its different interests. Landscape is very it's not as structured. It has a different type of structure, and I think what I found was more interesting was how most of the landscape works or any kind of these post-permit works are instigated by a planning permit. And I think it's about that interest about where does the planning permit come from, and I think that's really where it came from, is just saying it's good to see where to see a permit and read it, but where does all that kind of context come from, and all these permit conditions and all that detail that you get to, because all you see is a PSP, and then you go, oh, okay, and now I've got a landscape plan, which is a completely different level of scale that you're talking about. So yeah, then not so much one's less interesting than the other, but I think it depends on your focus. And I guess that's what Roger was talking about in terms of macro or micro scale of what you're interested in.
Roger, you've been around for quite a while. What's been the sort of biggest change that you've observed around sort of planning in sort of Greater Melbourne area? Would you say is that something you could put your finger on, perhaps even within the growth areas?
It's an evolving journey in terms of the development of Melbourne from 1990 onwards. Just the scale of development. You know, Melbourne, as people know, is a very low density, sprawled city, not as efficient as some other cities overseas, where, you know, we've tried to get away from that CBD centric city to having, you know, various district centres around the city, and a lot of our planning in the growth areas does involve that, with new activity centres and increasing densities around those activity centres, because we're growing at such a rapid rate. We're a city of over 5 million now, and we're planning for 8 million, as everybody knows. So there are all those challenges in terms of provision of infrastructure services. You know, the rates don't get you over the line anymore like they used to, and you know, things like developer contributions become more and more important, but even they don't cover the various costs associated with provision of infrastructure for residents that'll reside in those new growth areas. It's trying to make sure that we, you know, bring things, you know, to a human scale as well. You know, walkability is very, very important, which it wasn't, you know, when I first started. So there are a number of things that have taken place over the journey. It's always you know, as I mentioned before, it's such a dynamic area. It's always changing. It's ever changing. So yeah, you know, the growth councils, and we represent 3 of them, you know, are booming, and you know, the feedback that I get directly from developers, and you know, anecdotal feedback as well, is that we will be busier now that COVID, hopefully we're getting over the line. And you know, as an example, we certified 7,200 new lots last year, which is a massive number, and we'll get busier. So there are all those challenges, and but it's a very exciting field, as I said previously, and you know, you're constantly learning. I totally agree with Caitlin. You know, you could be in the job for 10 years, 30 years more, and you're constantly learning. So, and it's you know, you can actually see what you've approved on the ground, and it's a legacy that you leave behind, which is very, very important. Not just for yourself, but obviously the main area is the residents of the municipality.
Yeah. I mean, that's really interesting. I mean, kind of occurs to me, you know, building of essentially new cities, or be it, you know, very large territories. I mean, are there sort of, you know, is there a blueprint out there for what you're doing in terms of, you know, building out what are essentially sizable populations, but perhaps not in such a compact form as, you know, we have in the sort of inner suburbs and downtown?
Yeah, with various. Sorry, do you want me to go ahead, Nick?
That's a question to everyone, actually.
Yeah, with various philosophies.
Well, yeah, I mean, I actually was speaking to somebody at Wyndham Council, Ludo, I've forgotten his name now, Ludo Campbell Reed, that's right, yeah, and very interesting, and just asked me about, well, you know, what kind of city is it that can be built out here? It will be different from what's been done in the past, but what can it be, and are there inspirations, you know, either internationally or elsewhere in Australia for that? You know, actually being creative enough to think through what the possibilities are at a strategic level is an important part of what's going on, I think. So great to get a flavour of that, you know, the kinds of places or cities as a whole that you're doing, and then places within those.
Yeah, totally agree. And Jamie's and my former CEO he was a planner, and he went to Europe to study and drafted a book, which was quite fascinating reading. But you know, where they provide infrastructure, this is in France, outside of Paris, and you know, what we used to do in Melbourne back in the 19th century, building, you know, residential, commercial, or urban areas around the transport routes, tram and train lines, and that infrastructure was there for the residents to move into. And you know, we seem to be putting the cart before the horse now, bringing the residents in and trying to then retrofit, and, you know, or retro-build, I should say, not fit, infrastructure like you know, railway lines, for example. So that's interesting. So we did it, you know, in the 19th century. We sort of 180 degrees away from that currently.
It sounds like we've gone backwards in terms of planning. That's not a good message to
no, well, there's a lot of lobbying undertaken by all municipalities. My two, you know, current and previous municipality, I know that they've lobbied very strongly for various infrastructure. At the moment, we're lobbying for a public hospital in Melton, you know, for additional railway stations, electrification of the railway line. You know, people are moving out to satellite cities like Ballarat, when that the electrified line will certainly assist people commuting and living, you know, maybe pushing people to the regional cities as well, where affordability becomes an issue in Melbourne.
I mean, I was just going to jump in there, because I mean, it's obviously, with everything you just said there, it is actually pretty difficult to create a measure of density, you know, in some of the growth areas, I think. But maybe that's an opportunity for each of you to say a bit about, you know, places where, you know, town centres, those sort of activity centres, destination points, you know, are actively being constructed or have a good prospect of growing to a meaningful size. Maybe you could talk us through some examples and some of the challenges with those. That would be really useful, I think.
We obviously try to create 20-minute neighbourhoods, so where you have access to commercial, educational uses. As Roger sort of indicated, sometimes the commercial development lags behind the residential settlement. So we do try to activate places in that interim period. So for example, we've had a developer construct a sales office, but also create 2 meeting spaces and a cafe that form part of the sales office. It's a joint project between council and the developer, and council's community development team use the meeting spaces for members of the community to congregate. After the sales office closes, the centre or hub operates as a function centre. It's also adjacent to a park, and for those of you that know the child writer May Gibbs, she wrote Snugglepot and Cuddle Pie. They've got an adventure playground that draws inspiration from that children's book. So we do try, we acknowledge that there is that interim period where the commercial development is sort of lagging behind the residential, but we actively collaborate and try and encourage these types of projects to occur in the interim period.
Caitlin, yeah.
Yeah, I don't have too much work in the space because it's quite a niche space, but urban design frameworks and things like that is kind of where activity centres really kind of grow from a conceptual perspective, from going from being a purple blob on a PSP to actually going into that detail about what it is and what is it meant to be doing and what's its purpose and its kind of its overall mission statement. A lot of that work it's quite detailed and really is I think a really interesting blend of strategic and statutory really happening in real time, because you're going from really what is a high level kind of concept of what it is that we're trying to achieve versus then fundamentally trying to provide that framework for the statutory side to then actually roll with it. And they're so diverse. There's no such thing as a cookie cutter kind of design for an activity centre. They don't necessarily have the same objectives all the time, especially with what Roger and Jamie were touching on, which is that some infrastructure is out of the local government layer, and we're relying on state and even federal kind of initiatives to kind of run in the background, and we're speculating where they sit in that timeline, and how do we kind of start to work in. And as all that's growing, we've still got people buying homes and trying to set up families and start their community, all while concurrently everything's kind of moving at different levels and different speeds. So activity centre planning and that kind of space is really interesting, because what you think is going to happen today and what you put in today is not necessarily what's going to look like in 5 years or 10 years. And I think that's where that flexibility aspect of growth area planning comes into play, which is that PSPs can be 10 years old and still be implemented at the standard that they are at the time. So there's a lot of changes that are occurring and you're making variations and alterations during the permit process, because you're learning what best practice is. Urban design 10 years ago is not the same urban design that we're currently running at. So I guess that's really what's interesting, especially from activity centre space, because that's really just like a bubble within a very bigger part of growth area planning.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, isn't it? The sort of the speed of change, and I think Roger mentioned some of the figures about the number of units that are being built out, but also the duration of some of the PSPs, which, so you've got speed and also longer durations together, which are interesting sort of interplay, I think, there. We do actually have a question, so I'll read this one out, and it's from Hussein, who's asking, how does council conduct their feasibility studies, and what feedback has been generated or acquired recently on those feasibility studies, I guess?
That probably happens at the strategic level. So I think the three of us work in statutory planning, and we would implement the policy that the strategic planners create. So there's probably a bit more information that maybe a strategic planner could provide, but there's obviously a series of documents that are prepared as part of the preparation of strategic plans. So there's land contamination assessments, there's economic feasibility studies, there's arborist reports, there's urban design frameworks, there's heritage assessments, so there's drainage strategies, servicing strategies. So there's quite a lot of documentation that's prepared in order to make determinations and to prepare these strategic plans.
Very much so. We also tend to organise working groups, and the strategic planners tend to drive those, and the growth area planner with the statutory expertise would assist and play a critical role. The one example that I've got, and Caitlin touched upon it, and it's very important, some PSPs are 10 years old, and we have one at Melton at the moment, which was gazetted in 2011, and that's being reviewed at the moment, because obviously standards have changed quite, the situation has changed quite substantially. So that document may not be relevant anymore. And within that PSP area, we've actually produced an urban design framework for the what's called the Cobble Bank Metropolitan Activity Centre, adjacent to the new railway station, and there'll be a lot of, and it's going to be a centre of a retail component of about 70,000 square metres, but a street-based centre primarily, not your standalone box, and it'll be more to to human scale. You know, people will be encouraged to take public transport, not just drive. And that was only approved in late 2019. So, but that sets the parameters, the guidelines for council, for developers, property owners and others, which is it'll be a very interesting project when you know, it'll take 20 to 30 years potentially. But, you know, standards do change and you've always got to review and revise as standards do change. And that's why I was saying before, it's such a dynamic field that it's always changing.
I think probably, I remember interviewing a developer, and I think I won't name the developer, but they were complaining bitterly to me that, you know, in universities we educate students to be very critical of developers, or at least in planning degrees. You know, that, you know, perhaps from a planning point of view, they're, you know, considered the enemy. I'm sure my property colleagues teaching property students would you know, obviously have a different story to tell. But you mentioned a bit about relationships with developers, and I wondered whether, you know, you could talk a bit about, you know, perhaps some of the really good relationships that result in good places, and you know, some of the relationships which are perhaps less good and generate a few issues along the way. That might be quite interesting for people to hear about, I think.
With Wyndham, we have we're all about relationship building, and that's because you really can't get across the line unless you're all working together. And it's all about acknowledging perspective, is that the developer is not an evil corporation. They just have a bottom line, and they have to make sure that they're running a business. And there's an aspect to that we have to acknowledge and appreciate, that they're not doing this for free. And in return, you know, the developer needs to understand that we're public servants, and our goal is about community service and about making sure that we're building communities that will live 100+ years, if that's our goal. So we have a lot of things like monthly meetings where it's all just about keeping constant contact and making sure that we are talking to the developer, which is, funnily enough, a conglomerate of multiple types of consultants that represent the project. It's not just one singular human you talk to. You're talking to the engineering consultant and the planning consultant, and you build different relationships with different counterparts to those projects. And it's about being able to be honest about saying, when someone puts an amendment and going, this isn't right, or this doesn't make sense, what can we do to negotiate a better outcome, or, you know, why are you doing this? And once you kind of take away some of those barriers, you're able to have far more franker conversations, but conversations are actually a bit more productive, because you are taking away a bit of that clinical aspect of being in working relationships. It's a bit easier to have those chats and bring different types of people into that conversation and be a bit more collaborative rather than oppositional all the time. A big thing is also we bring in officers who may not necessarily be privy to all those conversations to make sure our culture is good. So things like you bring in an admin officer just to kind of meet what these types of professions are, and so they don't get this idea of the bad developer or that kind of negative connotation with it. It's about making sure that everyone's on the same ride together, and you find that if you're all kind of on the same page, it's a lot easier to work together as well, because that's ultimately what you're doing.
Yeah, I tend to agree, and relationship building is so critical to making sure you get the best end product that you can possibly get, and working with rather than against developers. I'll let Jamie talk about the formal process they have at Whittlesea, but we have a similar process at Melton, where we have you know, all the key internal stakeholders being, you know, landscape architects, urban designers, engineers and others, where the planner is the coordinator of that team. He's the project manager internally, and also we have those regular, you know, pretty much fortnightly meetings with people like Lendlease and Mirvac, because their estates are massive, and they'll be here for a good decade. What I say here, Melton Council. So we do have those meetings where we can discuss issues, matters that need to be resolved, what priorities are, you know, in terms of staging. You know, we should be expecting from them. So, you know, we're fed that information as well, and we'll advise them where things sit in terms of their projects. So I find that we do end up getting a better product on the ground than if we were just working against each other. So Yeah, maybe Jamie can elaborate on their process as well. I won't go too far into it, Jamie.
No, it's very similar in terms of how we operate with regard to the other councils. We do have regular meetings with the developers, and the frequency does depend on the complexity of the application and what stage of development it's at. Obviously, a lot of our developers, you know, can stay with work on projects for 10 years, and they have multiple precincts. It's in their interest as well to produce a good product, and yeah, relationship building is really important for us to consider all the facets and have an understanding of what the issues are. Similarly, internally, we have sort of internal stakeholder meetings as well to ensure that we're giving clear communication to the developer and having information come from one single voice. There's lots of internal stakeholders that we need to consult through the application process. So it's important that as planners we coordinate that feedback and provide advice that's consistent and timely.
Yeah, I quite often say that the planner has been the project manager internally, particularly in my current workplace. They're not just the project managers of their application, but they're also ultimately the decision maker in a collaborative environment. And it's their job is to ensure that all stakeholders are informed or appraised of, if we seek further information from the developer, why we're doing it. And when you build those positive relationships with developers and you seek further information from them, they tend to be more agreeable to it and won't necessarily question all the time why you're seeking that. You have those positive relationships where they trust you. And sometimes planners can be viewed in a negative sense as obstructors of development, where we work in growth areas where land has been set aside for, and there are precinct structure plans in place where land can be developed. So we want to make sure that we get the best return, best outcome, and having those positive relationships tends to do that.
No, so it's all really useful insights there, and I think probably one of the reasons why we obviously have things like group work as well, just as a really core basic skill, to be able to get on with people and bit of give and take. I think so for any of our students listening, that's one of the reasons why we tend to have group work and want you to get along and work as a team. We've got a couple of good questions here. One is quite a general one, which is more about how the growth areas as a whole, the extent of them are determined, and how much within each local government area is determined as growth areas. So I think this is really reflecting, I suppose, the state's role in demarcating the urban growth boundary. But of course, that might have some specific effects in each of your local authority areas that you might want to talk about. And an interesting question, which is, I think is pretty topical in a way, the outer reaches of Melbourne, outer suburbs in London as well, are now reception areas for incoming populations, immigrant populations, settling in Australia. So there's a question from Hussein again about how, as new growth areas are coming up, how different religious or interfaith activities are provided for. So reflecting that sort of ever-changing mix of populations that are now visible in the outer suburbs, probably changing from perhaps what they might have been in the 1960s. So a couple of questions there. Feel free, any of you, to jump in on either of those.
I'll jump on the second question in relation to, I guess, housing diversity and housing typologies. It's really important that we're accommodating development that is able to respond to our population, our ageing population, and different types of household types. So certainly we're wanting to, locate units in appropriate locations, apartments and townhouses and higher densities in our commercial precincts and adjacent to our commercial precincts, We also want to provide some flexibility as well. So particularly now with COVID, is looking at living and working arrangements, looking at home offices and shop tops and shared accommodation. So it's important that we look at dwellings that can be adapted to suit changes in family life cycles. So I feel like that will become more and more important issue as we move forward.
Yeah, I guess there are, just in the first part of the question, there are 7 growth councils in Melbourne, and really the state government, determines the urban growth boundary, and that's sort of changed, been very flexible over the years. It's changed about a dozen times. I guess the majority of the councils, except Whittlesea, the PSPs are prepared by the state government and we assist, whereas Whittlesea in the past have prepared their own PSPs with the state government assisting. And I guess the philosophies are, you need to really, because the PSPs are at such a broad level, they show the main roads, they show the blobs where the residential will go, where the commercial will go, where the open space, the broader, larger open space, and things like schools, public schools, which the minister is now responsible for, the responsible authority for, and also private schools. So there are, we are a lot more multicultural now than we were, 20, 30, 40 years ago. And there are demands, and where I work, there is a fairly large subcontinental population that has moved in and moving in. So there are a lot of temples and a lot of applications, planning applications for temples, particularly Hindu temples. And it's a matter of, I guess, the denomination purchasing the land, preferably having initial discussions with us to ensure that the site locality is appropriate. Sometimes they don't, and leads to some issues. But I guess it's the PSP is more reactive when it comes to that. It doesn't really set aside land. To Hussein's initial question, doesn't set aside land specifically for temples or mosques or churches or whatever it may be. We new urbanist theory and all that sort of stuff, trying to get densities close to town centres, so that people walk, is still prevalent and has been for the last 30 odd years. Making sure that you get permeability in your street network, I guess subdivision designs of the 1980s, you had a lot of curvilinear estates, and as a crow flies, you might travel 2 kilometres to get somewhere, but because the streets are curvilinear, it might take you, 4 or 5 kilometres to get there. So, having a permeable road network is quite critical as well. But yeah, there's some of the, I guess, sorry, talked probably too much. Caitlin, did you want to add anything?
Oh no, you touched on it. I was just going to say that there are applied zones within the PSP, and they're kind of really what are dictating very unique building types that might come up, which is things like theological buildings and places of assembly and things like that. So the PSP isn't too prescriptive about those elements, with the exception of non-government schools, which don't have to be necessarily religious. They could just not public. They're just not a public school.
Yep. We've got another couple of questions, so I'll bundle these together, but they're different questions. So one of them is probably a mixture of politics and planning, as always, but it's a question about whether you believe the state government places too much emphasis on the CBD versus the growth areas, perhaps in terms of resources or just focus in terms of planning even. I think, really thinking hard about what is going to take place in the growth area. So, controversial question, I suppose, but it's an important one. That was from Yarwin, I think, and one from Lippy here about whether the sort of housing typologies, perhaps other aspects of placemaking, have changed at all in light of COVID-19. I think we had one of our previous industry night discussions, and I know some of the panelists focused a bit on that, about the way in which some of the suburbs will need to change in terms of providing different kinds of spaces, perhaps for people working from home, smaller sort of co-working spaces, etc. Thinking creatively about how to rework and perhaps create new spaces. So two different questions there. Again, throw it open to the panelists to take one or both of those if you feel up to the challenge of both.
With the first question, I'd say I wouldn't say that the state government is particularly got a particular focus on one or the other. I think things like the outer suburban rail shows that they do have a concern about the peripheral suburbs and our peripheral councils and how they connect back into our CBD. In terms of more strategic level, we are about decentralizing and picking out activity centre areas and making sure that there are jobs available in our councils that aren't necessarily CBD centric. So I wouldn't say that. I think from a planning perspective, there's definitely lots of policy and strategy that says we shouldn't be worrying so much about being too centralized because it's counterintuitive to about urban sprawl and kind of putting a lot of pressure on other infrastructure that we have available. In terms of how that works in real time, I really probably wouldn't be able to talk too much to that. I don't have too much historical place and from a career perspective, but from what I can see, it seems promising from an infrastructure perspective at least.
There's been a greater focus on growth areas these last few years, particularly with the Victorian Planning Authority. We've also been seeing some releasing of grants as well to help individual growth area municipalities work on system improvements or the creation of policies to help those growth area councils. So, yeah, Roger, I'm not sure what your thoughts are on that.
I agree. I agree, Jamie. And with Caitlin as well, there's a lot of policy direction there. Obviously, the CBD is the main centre for Victoria. It's second biggest city in Australia, and but there has been a lot of policy direction over the years. With the initial 14, I think it was, district centres as they were called in those days, and there's so much work. We seem to lag behind a little bit, behind Wyndham and Whittlesea in terms of densities and bulk scale. Just driving along the Geelong Princess Highway and having a look at some of the new developments in the city of Wyndham. Really impressive, and they've really value added quite significantly, and with Whittlesea as well. A lot of the other stuff around Epping and in particular, I guess where the new hotels are and the private hospital made such a significant improvement and difference. So the state government has been contributing money, policy, direction to the growth area councils over the journey. So, and they are trying to decentralise. And I think COVID's going to have a lot of, we were talking about, working from home or working from other, not necessarily going to the CBD. I think COVID just is fast tracking that. People are already talking about, potentially, flexibility in their work environment. I know we are at the moment, and we provided something to our leadership team, the executive leadership team and the CEO. So I think, with the new housing stock as well, the scope for home offices so people can work from home is going to become more prevalent, I think. And the type of houses, we've already seen, the average block in the time I've been a planner, reduced from about 650, 700 square metres down. The average these days is about 300, which is, very, very small. And there are implications with climate change. You only have to look at Western Sydney, where temperatures are hitting around the Penrith area, 50 degrees Celsius, and they're going to be uninhabitable, in, 20, 30 years time. The blocks are getting smaller. There are less trees. In my municipality, when you look at the heat map on Melbourne, we have the most red. So we're the hottest part of Melbourne. We actively encourage the planting of trees wherever we can. My previous workplace went through that in the 90s and 2000s, and they've done a great job in planting hundreds of thousands of trees to not only to beautify it, but make the environment a more livable environment.
We've got some other questions coming, which are about the skills required. But before we get onto that, I was just fascinated with what you just said last there, Roger. I mean, for all the things that have improved in planning terms, obviously, sort of relatively large houses built on small lots, out in some of the growth areas. You know, that's how. What do people see as some of the potential solutions to that? You know, different morphologies, different solutions to what is a tricky problem, because you know land prices are pretty high. What people want to pay for a house is is a certain amount probably, but I guess we've got to get more creative somehow with that.
You know, Justin Madden, who was Minister for Planning, the students won't remember him, but he was also a very good footballer for the Carlton Football Club. He called them McMansions, and that's literally what they are. And you know, very inefficient in a lot of ways, and obviously, you know, a lot of our resources are finite. So we've got to think outside the square. You're quite right, Nick. As planners, as urban designers, as professionals in the development industry, and developers need to as well, because a lot of their arguments are affordability, and you know, a block that's 300 square metres in Fraser Rise, for example, is in excess of $300,000. That's not very affordable. And is making smaller to make them more affordable. So
there's a challenge to all the students listening in. You know, that you're the next generation, so solve that particular problem. Can you solve it pretty quick? I think is also the challenge. I mean, I'm just on that point. I mean, I'm amazed always at the scale of development, the scale of the industry here in the Greater Melbourne area compared to the UK, you know, where growth is typically tacked on to existing cities in relatively small, bite-sized chunks, probably not licensed on the scale that it is here. So there is a very big industry which has some big players which are well-resourced, have lots of skills, but it's also all the other issues that come with a very big industry. You know, it's a complex system of actors, and quite difficult to alter behaviours and patterns of development, really. But that's a rather abstract point, I guess, I'm making.
Oh no, it's a very valid point, and you've put it very well, I think, Nick. There's a lot of players there, and you know, Melbourne fits into Greater London, and you're obviously familiar with Greater London. Is it 2 or 2.5 times? Oh, sorry, Greater London fits into Melbourne the 2.5 times. So it's massive. You know, we're very sprawled, and that's why London is such an efficient city, particularly with their public transport network.
Yeah, well, it's certainly got a very dense rail and public transport network compared to Melbourne, that's for sure.
It's a fantastic network.
Well, I mean, just having a debate with somebody about activity centres. So Croydon, which I'm a little bit familiar with, which is now actually sort of going downhill a little bit in terms of the employment concentration that was there. It grew in the 1960s. It's only 15 minutes from the centre of London by train, and of course, something like Dandenong, which has been, you know, sort of struggling to make itself into an activity centre, is 45 minutes. You know, by train. So, you know, that era of collecting some of the back office functions you might have got, I mean, that's now receding anyway, the sort of big back offices. But you know, that gives you some idea of the sort of the accessibility in terms of time that you would probably need in a sort of a metro area to sort of generate some of that activity centre. But hey, let's get on to some of the other questions. So we have got a question here, and I think we'll probably have 1 or 2 more as well. Because you know our students were interested in perhaps finding out a bit more detail about the kinds of skills or qualities that are required of you know an urban planner, probably either a statutory planner or a strategic planner in some of the growth areas. Maybe you could sort of cover some of those key skills. Some of them are probably generic. We've mentioned some of them, you know, a bit of ability to work with people, obviously, but are there particular skills that you pick out if you're working in the statutory side of things versus the strategic side of things?
So obviously technical skills are helpful, but we also acknowledge that particularly for a graduate, you might not have work experience. So it's really important to know too that soft skills are really valuable. So a lot of what we do is communicating, collaborating, negotiating. So even if you're having a job interview, to give examples about a group project where you were able to overcome some difficult obstacles and collaborate with the team. Those are all really valuable skills. And yeah, that's really beneficial to being a town planner.
Yeah, yeah, and probably to add to that for Jamie is the openness to research and not being reluctant to actually just kind of get into the nitty-gritty parts of what you're doing, because there's a lot of legislation, there's a lot of policy and strategy that sometimes you just got to be keen to read and just unfortunately dredge through the documents. So I think it's just that openness to actually get your head around something that's a bit more complex, and just knowing that, hey, you don't know the answer, but you're willing to find it. And I think that's half of what planning is going, I have no idea, but I'm going to figure it out, and I'll by myself or with someone else, and we'll actually, by the end of it, we'll be able to make a decision or give advice on the issue. So yeah, the not being daunted by doing a little bit of work and that bit of research to get there.
Yeah, I'd like to add, particularly for a recent graduate, I'd always recommend trying to get if you can, trying to get a statutory planning position first. I find that tends to build the foundation for the professional. I have friends, former colleagues, one, fairly senior positions in local government, and one's always regretted that he hasn't started, that he's in the strategic field. He regrets not at least doing a year or two of stat planning, just to get that, build that foundation, understand the planning scheme, as Jamie indicated earlier, that technical knowledge, and then you can build into, trying to do some strategic work as well, because a growth area planner in particular, and I often say they don't grow on trees, and it is a field that's that will we've grown to 6 growth area planners at Melton. We had 2 in the past, so it is a growing field, but that technical ability, plus you need to be able to see the big picture and not get caught up in the minutiae of things. So I'd really encourage, get that foundation first as a stat planner, and then hopefully that can lead to a strategic or growth area planning position. And there will be more of those positions in the future, hopefully for graduates as well. And a lot of planners are, in terms of their time, their professional timelines, they're probably getting closer to the end than the start. So there will be positions opening up, I'm sure, over the next 10, 20 years in particular, 5 to 10 years in particular. So yeah, definitely look at a stat position first is my recommendation. And having those negotiation skills, being a team player is very, very important because everybody's views are just as important as yours, and being a good listener, and then communicating those, the directions to applicants, to your team members, so they're not, there's ambiguity there, and you're clear and concise, and being able to, the communication skills in terms of written and verbal are very, very important as well. Just to, so that, you need to make sure that you are clear and concise in what you're saying or writing.
Maybe guys, you could give us a flavour also of, if someone went to work in one of your authorities, just how many planning colleagues would they be working with? We're talking about big organisations here, where there's a lot of planning going on. There are a lot of planners, in some local authorities in Britain. There might only be 4. But what's the scale of the teams we're talking about here, and the division of labour and the complexity? And you mentioned, I think earlier, Caitlin, about being able to interact with a whole bunch of disciplinary specialists as well.
Yeah, in my planning department, I think there's 30 to 40 officers, roughly, and they range between technical administration to team leaders and coordinators, so there's everyone in between. There's a pretty healthy balance between all of them, and we're split into 2 components, which is our established team and our growth area planning team. So and that's just to kind of especially from a growth perspective, to kind of provide that specialized team that focuses on our PSPs and our those types of applications. In terms of the greater organisation, if you're talking about all the other teams that you work with, it'd be 100 plus, I reckon, easily, between your engineering and your drainage engineers and all the other kind of counterparts that you work with. It's quite a big body of people that you work alongside.
At the City of Whittlesea, we probably have about 15 planners, 3 planners at leadership level. We have subdivision officers. We also have admin support, as well as an ESD officer and a Creek Health officer. We've got 3 statutory planning teams. So the growth area team comprises of 5 officers plus a team leader. And then we have 2 teams that work predominantly in the established areas, but they also do some of the smaller projects in the growth areas of the municipality. And similarly with Caitlin, in terms of people outside of the department, there's numerous, difficult to count, but yeah, you've got strategic transport engineers, heritage advisors, urban designers, biodiversity planners, waste management officers, and the list goes on.
I guess we're similar now to Whittlesea and Wyndham in terms of the numbers in the department, the planning services department. We weren't a couple of years ago, but we've tried to get on the front foot and be proactive so that we adequately resource the growth area in particular, because we are next cab off the rank, so to speak. And so we have a department of about 30 people. That department is split in 2 into stat planning, or established areas, and growth areas, which are the major developments. There are now 6 planners in the major developments team, 2 coordinators, myself included. So we have 3 planners each that we're responsible for. We also have a subdivision certification team of 2 officers and an admin support person, plus each planning team has an admin support person as well. So we have grown over the last 18 months in anticipation of all the growth, and COVID hit, but we will get busier. And yeah, as Jamie and Caitlin both said, we do work with a number of other departments. They're very key to our decision-making process. We don't make our decisions on our own. It's always in collaboration. You know, engineers, urban designers, landscape architects in particular, but there are other departments that we rely on depending on the nature of the application. But we're not as big, or, you know, we've got probably 700 staff, whereas I know, you know, others, I think, Jamie, you guys are about 1,300 or thereabouts, so much larger organisation.
Well, we're drawing to a close, but you know, I think you mentioned another issue, which is another complexity, of course, another challenge, that the fact that, you know, the growth areas do have established areas as well as brand new growth, and, you know, both things occurring at once and
Yeah.
needing to be managed and planned in different ways. So that's another, you know, another challenge or you know, scope of the work that's out in the growth areas. Before we go, maybe you want to make a pitch to attract one of the students that's out there. Why come and work in Wyndham or Whittlesea or Melton or whatever? You know, give them a soundbite as to why they should rock up at your place.
Sure, I'll go.
Put you on the spot there a bit, but
No, it's really, like, the work that we do is challenging, but it's also really exciting working with such a diverse group of people and different bodies and authorities. You're getting to sort of expand your level of expertise by working with all these different people, and also being able to create communities and you know, set the scene for many generations to come. So not many opportunities to do that. Certainly working in established areas, the framework is already set, but you're really able to make a difference in a growth area planning role.
follow that.
Yeah, no. From a graduate who went straight into a growth area council, there's nothing more fun than going into the deep end and learning it all as you're going, and the pace is incredibly amazing. You're never bored. You're constantly learning. You're doubting yourself and then getting small wins and big wins all at the same time. And there's nothing more exciting coming straight out of uni and actually kind of just getting a handle of what you want to do and what you're really interested in doing. And growth area planning has a really niche opportunity to give you an exposure to all sorts of types of things that you may not necessarily get in more infill environments, and you actually start to learn what you do and don't enjoy working in, and those types of interests that come out of that space. You learn how to read engineering plans and stormwater management strategies and all these weird documents that you've never heard of before that get given weird acronyms that you don't know what they mean. And it's always fun sitting in a room and everyone's using slang terms and abbreviations, and you're like, okay, I'm gonna have to write that down and figure out what that means later. If all the spaces to kind of learn from the bottom up, I think growth area planning is incredibly forgiving, and growth area councils are learning as they're going as well. It's still quite new to a lot of teams, and a lot of officers are in those teams have never worked in that space. So you're not going to be the only person learning as you're going. And all the growth councils are incredibly super centric on training, super centric on skill facilitation, and are really invested in you doing the best thing and the best work you can do, because even if you move councils, it doesn't matter if someone wins either way. It's all about adding into the collective pool, and I think that's been the most rewarding experience of it all, to be honest.
Yeah, all very valid points. I totally agree. And from an individual perspective, you're basically evaluating to yourself because you're learning new skills. As Caitlin said, you're basically, you're reading engineering plans, you're reading landscape plans, you're reading other things that you wouldn't normally do as a stat type planner. So hopefully those new skills will hold you in better stead when you're within the organisation or somewhere else. And we've got to be, people do leave, but it'll certainly expand your horizons. And you're also dealing with a blank canvas, so to speak, in the growth areas. You're starting from scratch. You're implementing various policies that council and state government have come up with. And, you're basically going to be adding to the municipality, to the future residents of that municipality. You'll leave that legacy behind, as I mentioned earlier. Even when you drive past, you'll see something you're actively involved in, think, oh, that's a pretty good outcome. Sometimes it may not be such a great outcome, but we all learn from our mistakes, I guess. But, we, as I said before as well, Melton are the next cab off the rank. Wyndham, a lot of developments occurred there. We'll see the same. The southeast with with those growth area councils, they're mostly being developed. So we've got a blank canvas, and we need some. We'll need talented people in the future that can utilise their skills to make it a better place for the existing and future residents.
Well, some really, really good words there. The ability to leave a legacy or have a legacy, and which is not many of us can say that. To actually have had a hand in building out new communities, but the fact that you can learn such a lot in like hothouse yourself in terms of how much you can acquire knowledge and skills in a relatively short period of time, because so much is happening. And then I think the idea that I think you mentioned, Caitlin, that it is also a forgiving environment in the sense that a lot of things are being learned as the development occurs. So these are all really interesting and great comments, I think. We've come pretty much to the end of our allotted time, I think, and I don't think there are any other questions waiting for us. So I think what I will do is just say thank you to all of you panelists, to Jamie, to Roger and Caitlin for sparing time and talking us through it and providing a lot of great insights, and and communicating some of that enthusiasm as well for why you love working in the growth area councils. Fantastic to have you. We have recorded this, I think, so for anyone who's still there, if you want to get on and listen to it again, check some of the details, or if you want to pass it on and advertise it to people, please feel free to do so. So I think with that we'll draw things to a close. We will have another one of these sessions, I think later in the year, because there are obviously 4 other Growth Council reps who will come along. You might get a slightly different picture, but probably will cover some of the same themes in a different way, I think, and certainly emphasise the dynamism of some of these places that need you as planners. So I think for now it's enough for me to say thanks again to everyone for listening and for the panelists, and bye for now.
Thank you very much. Take care.
Thank you.
Thanks, Vic. Thanks, everybody.